So let's go ahead and start talking about how do we go about creating a database. Uh, I was actually trying to explain this to someone the other day, and I realized that creating a database and the skill and ability to create a database is kind of like trying to explain to someone how to ride a bicycle. If you really think about it, it's a lot of intuition and it's a lot of kind of just knowing how to work your body almost subconsciously. That may sound kind of weird, but when it comes to building databases, it's kind of the same way. It's a lot of practice and trying things, and sometimes you end up kind of falling off, and you have to go back and revisit how to build. But it's something you have to kind of train your brain to think about. It's kind of almost a certain way of thinking about things. So I'm going to start off with this video and just kind of talk about how do you identify objects and maybe how does your brain need to start thinking about things when you start talking about how do I build a database, how do I create a database, how do I create tables and columns and primary keys and foreign keys, and if I'm normalizing and indexing, how do I do all of these things? Um, and maybe not necessarily do it right the first time, but at least get to thinking about it and thinking about the world in terms of data. So let's kind of go through a scenario of a library. And we want to build a database for a library so that they're able to do things like track the books that are in the library, track who are the loaners or members of the library, what books have those people checked out of the library, things of that nature. So obviously that's a big deal, being able to track, the inventory, the movement of that inventory, and things like that. So that's kind of where I want to start. And I want you to kind of open your mind a little bit too, especially if you're new to the concept of database design. Follow along with me. So let's start off with a book. So a book is kind of what you think of naturally when you think of the library. You go to the library to check out books. There's always a lot of books in the library. So when you start to kind of break down and identify the actual data elements that you would need in a database when building a piece of software for a library, you always want to start to think about what are the nouns, what are the objects that will be interacting and interfacing within a piece of software, right? Because that's the ultimate goal. Is we're building a database to be able to store data that would eventually be used with another piece of software like a web application, a mobile application, desktop app, things like that. So in order for us to be able to do that, we have to know what data are we trying to collect, what are those elements or objects that we want to capture in the database, what do we want to be able to represent in data. So the book is the obvious one. There's shelves of books, and those books typically come with certain attributes or values that are associated to that book. So you have things like ISBN number, title, Dewey Decimal. Um, if you're familiar with card catalog style information, you have things on there like page count, the author of the book, copyright date, maybe topics or keywords that help identify what's the contents of the book, and then the publisher of the book. And I could go on. There's tons of stuff. I'm sure if you really dug into um, cataloging systems and the way that libraries track books and things like that, I'm sure there's tons and tons and tons of properties or elements that we could come up with. So let's just start there. So one of these elements has what I like to think of as a relationship, and that's the author. So the author can write multiple books. So you kind of almost want to have this another data element about just the author, and you kind of want to kind of extract it from the book because you can have an author, and that author can have multiple books. And likewise, you could technically have a book, and that book could have multiple authors. So you start to kind of identify this almost one-to-many relationship. So if you kind of extract the author out, that becomes another data element, and that author has additional data as well. And again, I'm sure I've oversimplified what's here, but the author has its own properties or values. You have first name, last name, maybe the location where the author has written, the publisher that the author has, the location of the publisher, birth date, things like that. And again, I'm sure I've oversimplified this very much. We could probably come up with all kinds of additional qualifiers about an author, but you want to make sure that those qualifiers or elements are related to the overall objective of the library system. So with those two pieces now, and I hope you're starting to kind of see this concept of a table, because we can have a table with our books and we can have a table with our authors. And just like when you write SQL statements, there's relationships that exist between these two. The books have authors, so you'd start to identify things like um, primary keys. You would have an author primary key or an author ID, and then your books would have an ID as well. And kind of inherently within the data, your books have an ID, which is the ISBN. So you kind of start to think about, okay, now we've got some my primary identifiers. The books and the authors are related in some kind of way. So maybe you're starting to see a little bit of, hey, I could write a select ISBN, comma title, comma topics, and then comma first name, comma last name from books, inner join on author using the author ID, and you could start to get a collection of books and authors. So let's go another step further. So you have people that are loaning or taking books out of the library. So now you've introduced this entirely other data element or construct of a loaner. So that loaner, similar to an author in some respects, has a first name, a last name. You're going to capture their address. That includes things like street address, city, state, zip. You're going to give them a library card, so that'll probably have a library card number or a library card identifier. You'll probably want to know things like their birth date and their gender, just for demographic reasons. Age. Age could be stored, age could be computed based on birth date. Not to get into the nitty gritty, maybe education level, and again, we could come up with all kinds of other factors that we want to capture around a loaner. But again, with that loaner now, we can now start to build relationships. So we can start to say, hey, this loaner checked out a book. This book was checked out by this loaner. And then we start to understand again those relationships between this book and the book has loaners, or people that are loaning the book. And this is all very simplistic of, we have one book with one author and we have one loaner, just based on this kind of thinking diagram that we have in front of us. But this is where you start, because then eventually you're going to get to the point where you have lots of books. So then you need to start to think about, how do I take that concept of all of these books and handle them, because then we're going to have lots of people with lots of books. So I know that this video is a little abstract and it's kind of a Kickstarter to get your brain thinking, but I hope that it helps you start to understand this concept of, you have to look at a situation and you have to kind of think outside the box in maybe some ways, but at the same time you need to start to identify those objects within whatever use case you're working in. So if someone were to come to you and say, hey, I need you to build this database, and they say, we're building a database for a library, or we're building a database for an inventory tracking system, or we're building a database for a school system, or we're building a database, I don't know. I mean, realistically, you could build a database for just about any system, but it kind of requires you to kind of twist your brain a little bit and start to think differently about what it takes and what the goals are of the database that you're trying to build. So as we continue through this particular module, keep thinking about that and how that works.